This paper describes some work we've done sampling birds, bats and small mammals within the Chernobyl exclusion zone. And the motivation for the work was often the endpoint of wildlife assessments in terms of radioactivity are protected species. However, there are not very much data for protected species, and it's quite difficult to go out and collect protected species and analyse them. So one thing we want to know is, can we use a surrogate species which will allow us to analyse that and then be sure we're protecting the species that are protected, the very endpoints of our assessments. The reason we've done this in the Chernobyl exclusion zone is it allows us to measure some radio elements which we couldn't measure in wildlife elsewhere, so we can measure plutonium and strontium, for instance, as well as cesium.
So how do we go about doing this work? Well, we went to a site in a medium contaminated area within the Chernobyl exclusion zone, running along the area of the Western Trace. And at that site, we sampled a range of small mammals, including shrews, mice, voles. We also sampled a range of small birds, things like robins, and we sampled a range of bat species. These samples were live monitored to determine cesium and strontium activity concentrations. This is something that we are uniquely able to do within the Chernobyl exclusion zone because of the activities encountered, but also because of the fact that Chernobyl Centre have developed monitoring capability for undertaking this type of live monitoring. We also analysed these samples to determine plutonium activity concentrations.
So the first thing we found was that birds and bats, firstly, are often protected species, and so very often the endpoint of our assessments. So the first thing we found was that if we sample unprotected species of mouse or vole, then the results from those would result in a protective assessment for birds and bats. However, we also sampled shrews, which are protected in a number of countries, and we found those to have a very high transfer of plutonium. So if we sampled a mouse, it would not always be protective of a shrew if that was the endpoint of your assessment. So we'd have to take that into account.
The other thing that comes out of the work that we've been doing is the fact that now we have a really good addition to the database of plutonium activity concentrations in wildlife from the zone, and actually plutonium in wildlife in general, because this is something that's really not well represented. And beyond that, we can then think towards what else our data can do. And there have been a number of different studies suggesting impacts of ionising radiation on wildlife within the zone. And one of the things that our data can do is hopefully help to improve the dosimetry associated with those studies and dose predictions for wildlife, so that when people then compare dose to effects, they're doing this in a much more realistic way and hopefully making much better use of their results as they move forward.